I was born on December 15th, 1905, at Poughkeepsie, New York, my hometown. At the age of 4 years and 3 months, my dad, 4 months, 4 years and 3 months, my dad showed me Halley's Comet, and I vividly remember it to this day. 1 month later, Glenn Curtis, the contemporary and competitor of the Wright brothers, flew down the Hudson River from Albany to New York, a distance of 152 miles. He was allowed to make 2 refueling stops, and he made one of them in a farm field across the road from my father's farm. I did not see him land, but my father took me over to see the flying machine after he landed. And I was so thrilled when he took off and flew down the river that I lost all interest in becoming a steam locomotive engineer. So I kept my interest in flying. I knew what I was going to do from that age, 4 years and 4 months. Never changed my mind. I was just one-track mind from then on. And my uncle, one uncle, was a mechanic in World War I. During that war, I watched quite a few airplanes fly in and out of Poughkeepsie. In fact, before the war, my father took me down to Mineola, Long Island on three occasions to what was then known as Hazelhurst Field, and I met my first pilot, Ruth Law, who was a very famous woman pilot. She guided me around the field and showed me the Blériot monoplanes and the Wright biplane that she owned and so forth, and the Farman biplanes and the Curtiss biplanes, and a few contraptions that wouldn't even fly. She let me sit in the seat of her Model B Wright airplane. That was quite a thrill. I think by that time I was about 9 years old. I'm not sure of the date, but I believe it was in 1914. The year that World War I started. I followed all the airplanes and all the exploits of the aces and others during that war. I followed the war from beginning to end, through newspaper reports and so forth. After the war, a barnstorming pilot came to Poughkeepsie, flying a very rickety and decrepit war surplus jetting, and he was hopping pastures from a pasture field there each afternoon and evening. I had a job in a machine shop for my summer vacation, and I helped them out each afternoon and evening after work, instead of going home for dinner. And he was rather impressed by the knowledge I had of aircraft and engines and the lure of flying, because I studied these books that my uncle had given me after the war, his whole library of books. And I studied them so carefully that I had flunked my French and my Spanish in high school, but I learned something that was useful. One of the books was a book called Aerobatics, written by Captain Horatio Barber, who was in charge of flight training in England during World War I. Captain Barber invented the word aerobatics, and he called his book Aerobatics. I still have it in mint condition. I studied that book backwards and forwards, so I knew everything in it very carefully, very thoroughly. At the end of the season, about October 15th, Swanee Taylor was the name of this barnstorming pilot. He was a sort of a ne'er-do-well, and was spending his life with wine and song and the speakeasies and so forth. But he finally gave me a ride in the airplane, about 5 minutes. And he flew me to another field at dusk. The sun had gone down, and he had to land quickly. So I just got about 5 minutes in the air. However, when we finished tying it down, he said, I have permission to leave it at this field for the winter. And I'm going to New York for the winter. And in the spring, I can get another better airplane, a war surplus jetty, for less money than it would cost me to have this one fixed up. So you can have it. He just gave the airplane to me. There were no regulations at that time, no bill of sale, no identifications, no license numbers or anything. He just gave me an airplane. I was approaching 18 years of age, 17 years and 10 months at the time. And so I found myself in possession of a real man-killing flying machine. And I had better sense than to tell my parents. They thought I was out riding my motorcycle. Each weekend, when I was in school, of course, later, I was in school by that time and had afternoons off. Each weekend, I was supposedly out riding my motorcycle. However, I was actually practicing with the airplane and doing everything that book said. I was taxiing around the field and learning how to taxi without ground looping or to deliberately ground loop to taxi, and to control the airplane and taxiing with ailerons instead of the rudder, as described in the book. By my birthday, on December 15th, I was making short flights, what we call grasshopping flight or grass cutting flights across the field. I had seen that down at Hazelhurst Field with the old Curtiss airplanes, so I figured I could do it with the Jenny. However, they were very different airplanes. The Curtiss airplane had a fixed nose wheel, so it would not ground loop. The Jenny was just the opposite. It had a tail skid and it wanted to ground loop at all times. But I learned how to control it. Finally, I was skimming over the grass at a foot or two altitude, and that taught me how to keep the wings level and to keep the airplane level, its flying level. And I did this repeatedly for more than half a month, the first half of December. And finally, on my birthday, the 15th of December, I found myself making one of these flights across the field and getting too close to the fence at the other end of the field, and I didn't want to damage the fence, so I opened the throttle the rest of the way and went over the fence, and found that I was on my first solo flight without knowing anything about how to turn. Very little anyhow. I made some very gentle turns while I was doing the grass cutting flight. When I was in the air, I don't know how long, floundering around, teaching myself to make back turns. And I imagine it was anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half. Then I started trying to come in over those high trees to get back down on the ground. And I would bounce a couple of times, and I had sense enough to open the throttle and go around. And then I'd get lost again and have to find the field and make another try. I finally gave up. I wasn't going to get over those trees and land before I hit that fence. So I went to the other field where the Swanee Taylor, the pilot, had been flying. And I had observed that he came over some telephone wires and closed the throttle and landed. So I did the same thing. I came in over the wires, closed the throttle, and made a good landing. Solo number one. So I took off again. I was elated. I took off again and went back to the original field, and after several attempts, I finally got it on the ground after only one graceful bounce. And when I taxied back, a man had driven in, a backwoods farmer type, had driven in a little Ford pickup truck, very small pickup. And he walked over and my engine was running. I was still in the airplane, and he said, "That sure was pretty the way you come down with that thing. You take people up?" I thought about 5 seconds, and I answered, "Sure." And he said, "How much it cost?" I said, $5, and I pointed. The engine was making a noise, and there was a big sign on the side of the airplane that said "Fly, $5" in white paint. And so I pointed to that and said, $5. He said, I ain't got that much money. I said, how much you got? He got a handful of change. I said, get in, we'll fly. So I had my first pay passenger on my third solo flight. And when I got back from that, not surprisingly, 2 other people wanted rides. And it was, sun was setting, it was getting ready to set. And so I made 2 more flights with pay passengers at $5 apiece. And that was great because I was paying 11 cents a gallon for automobile gas, and I needed it. And then I tied the airplane down for the night. And I called it, when I got home, of course, I've kept mighty quiet about this. I called a friend of mine who had another motorcycle fella, and we didn't have motorcycle gangs in those days. We just rode motorcycles for fun, and no gangs or anything like that. I didn't associate with that kind of people, but in fact, there weren't any. So he brought 2 5-gallon cans to another field in my direction. There was a large field, a beautiful big grass level field, and coincidentally, on that Saturday when I made my solo, it was beautiful weather in December, absolutely beautiful weather, and very, very mild. Even though the weather was, it was in December, it was wonderful flying weather, and it was still the same way the next day on Sunday. The first concrete road in the world had just been built by this field, and on that Saturday when I soloed, there was a constant parade of cars driving out from the city of Poughkeepsie to the end of the road and back, because the people had never seen such a smooth road before. All the roads were dirt roads, except Route 9, and that was the first one paved about 1916. And so I thought I'd better fly over there, and I would get a good business hopping passengers on Sunday. So I did that, and he met me with his motorcycle and 2 5-gallon cans of gasoline. So I hopped passengers all that day, getting paid $5 a piece for my practice landings. There was a constant stream of cars on that road going back and forth to the end of it. And the people in those days had never been near an airplane, never been that close. And the minute they saw the airplane parked there, they stopped and bought rides for $5 a head. And you know, $5 was quite a lot of money in 1923. It was worth at least 10 times that much. And it was really quite remarkable they spent so much, and especially the airplane was in such rickety condition, with barn paint on it and house paint and holes in the fabric and everything. But it did have an excellent engine. OX5 engines cost about $50 or less at that time. There were so many of them. And the owner, Swanee Taylor, the owner, had bought another engine. So I made quite a lot of money that day. However, about the middle of the afternoon, I recognized one of the passengers. His name was Mr. Gaber, and he was my father's office assistant. In fact, he was second in command of the company that my father was running. My father was not the owner of the company. He was general manager of a factory in Poughkeepsie, a dealer valve separator company, and they manufactured milking machines and cream separators. And my father was general manager. And Mr. Gaber was his assistant. And Mr. Gaber took his ride, and I kept my face away from him because I knew he had known me since I was born, and I didn't want him to see me, recognize me. However, after the flight, he got out of the airplane and turned around to give me the $5 bill, and he says, "Say, aren't you Theodore Miller's son?" And I admitted I was. He said, "I didn't know you were an aviator already." He'd already taken the ride with me, so I guess he was convinced. So I figured my goose was cooked because this was Sunday, and he would go into the office and tell my dad in the morning. But I went home that night and kept my trap shut, kept quiet, And the next day after school, Monday, I got home from school before he came home from work, and I expected an explosion. However, he didn't say a word. Everything was silent, and all through dinner, very quiet. And I was waiting on needles and pins, and he didn't say a thing. And I knew he had to know it because Mr. Gaber would surely tell him. But after dinner, he sat down and he said, "Say, John, Mr. Gaber tells me you gave him a ride in that airplane." And I admitted, and so I gave him the whole story. And he was a little bit surprised. But of course, in those days, people thought, well, you fly an airplane just like you drive an automobile. You steer it, that's all. And that's the idea he had, even though he was a mechanical engineer. And so he said, "I'll tell you, I know the airplane is in terrible condition, and you just fix that, or take it apart or something, and fix that up before you fly it anymore." So I did that. I spent all day, Christmas Day, December 1923, all alone, taking that Jenny apart. And believe me, that was a job because those are big wings, and I didn't want to bend them or break them. It was quite a difficult job. And I got it apart and put it in a barn where I had permission to keep it. And during the next spring once, we started working at a couple of, the same friend with a motorcycle and a couple of others gave me some help. And I had made enough money, I didn't tell my dad, but I had made enough money to order all the ready-made cotton covers, war surface from, and all the tape and the threads and needles and everything necessary to recover it, including a barrel of dope from the Dayton Airplane and Supply Company in Dayton, Ohio, and they shipped it to me. And I had money left over. I had made so much that one Sunday. It was remarkable how the people flew that day. Swanee Taylor never did that much business, but he didn't have a new concrete road to attract the traffic either. He had a swamp around him. So that summer, midsummer, we had the airplane flying, and I flew it the rest of the summer. And then I wanted to go to Pratt Institute of Technology to study mechanical engineering, which I did, and I sold the airplane. So while I was studying at Pratt Institute, I didn't do any flying until 1928 or so. But during that time, the Orteig Prize had been offered for the first flight to Paris. And I was very concerned because there was no airplane that could make it that I knew of, with the exception of possibly the experimental Balanca monoplane, which I'd read about. And so I was interested in fuel consumption. How would they ever get across the drink with the engines? But there was a laboratory, and in the laboratory they had a Ford racing engine on a dynamometer, and I spent several weekends working on that and checking it for fuel consumption. And we didn't have the instrumentation then that we have now. I had a stopwatch, and we had a vertical glass tube with graduations on it to measure fuel consumption. And we had oil temperature and water temperature gauges. We didn't have EGT instruments or anything like that. So I tested it with different mixtures, and I discovered that if I went on the backside of lean, that's what we call it now, lean peak, that the specific fuel consumption increased quickly. And I said, well, that's the way. And I noticed that the temperature of the water went down, and the fuel consumption went down, and the temperature of the oil went down. That's about all I could do. Because I didn't have any method of checking the temperature of the combustion chamber at that time. But I was studying mechanical engineering and knew what I was doing, and I said, well, now that's the way to fly across the Atlantic to save fuel. But what airplane would they use? Well, it happened that I think about 4 years before I graduated from Pratt, another man whose name I forget right now, I should know it, he graduated in mechanical engineering also, and he was the one who remodeled and redesigned the Ryan M1 airplane and produced the Spirit of St. Louis in San Diego later. I didn't know that was going on. But when Lindbergh flew across the continent with one stop at St. Louis in that airplane, which was a redesign by this man from Pratt Institute, my very school, I went out to see the airplane. In the meantime, I had gotten acquainted with Howard Stark, who had started to fly before I did, just about the time, maybe a year before I did. And Howard Stark had discovered the way to fly on instruments with a turn indicator. So when Lindbergh flew across the continent, landing at once at St. Louis, I cut classes to go out to see the airplane. And there I met Howard Stark, who by that time was beginning to be quite famous because of his flying on instruments. And he had published a pamphlet on how to use the turn indicator, and the airmail pilots were using that pamphlet, buying them from him by mail. And so it happened that he was there at the same time I was, and we stood there together and looked at the panel, the instrument panel in Lindbergh's airplane. And there we saw that he had a turn indicator, and he told me that Lindbergh was one of his customers and had been a mail pilot, of course, flying between St. Louis and Chicago, and had bought one of his pamphlets, and apparently probably knew how to use the turn indicator. In addition to the turn indicator, we saw that he had an earth inductor compass, which was at the cutting edge of development at that time, a very important instrument. And so we were standing about 50 feet away from the airplane at the moment, and Lindbergh was over by his airplane with several other people, and someone pointed out to him Howard Stark standing beside me. So Lindbergh walked over and complimented Howard Stark on his pamphlet. And I stayed quiet because I was just a neophyte pilot, and so I just didn't say a word. I just listened. And so he went back, and as I remember, about 2 days later, maybe it was the next day, I was out there again cutting classes, and it was, I heard the rumor that the next day he expected to take off. So I spent the night sitting on the floor in the lobby of the Garden City Hotel. It was loaded with reporters and cameramen and everything all night. And I understand that poor Lindbergh never even got a chance to get any sleep at all because of the commotion in the hotel, I guess. And so the next morning, it had been drizzling a little bit, and I got a ride over to the airport, and I watched him take off. And so I had that privilege, and I stood right behind him wondering which of those telephone poles he'd hit on the takeoff. He had a little over 400 gallons, that's 6 pounds per gallon of fuel, which is over 2,400 pounds. It was a heavy load for that airplane. The airplane, as I remember, had a 52-foot wingspan, and that's the only reason he got off. But one reason was that he had sense enough not to try to horse it off too soon, because that would just increase the drag, and he held it in the flying position. The ground was not muddy. It was wet, and there were little puddles, but it had not rained enough to make the ground muddy. I followed I followed the airplane as I towed it from Curtis Field through a sort of a gully and under some trees and so forth to get it onto Roosevelt Field, which is a bigger field. And then I followed that, and then I watched him from right behind the airplane, right straight behind him, and I watched the little two poles. He went right between the two poles and about 20 feet or so above the wires and disappeared in the distance in the murk. And I said to my friend standing by me, I said, We may never see the poor guy again, but we did. I watched the parade afterwards when he came back from England, big parade on Fifth Avenue. I graduated in mechanical engineering the next month. He took off on May 20th, 1927, and I graduated the next month. By that time, the Department of Commerce had started regulating aviation, and licenses were required if you're engaged in interstate commerce. Otherwise, you could fly without a license with an identification number on the airplane. I didn't have an airplane or the money to get one by that time after I graduated, and I went home and was wondering what to do. And I wrote a letter to the Department of Commerce in Washington asking for an application blank to take a test for a mechanic's license, because I'd studied the books and worked on the OX5 engine and so forth, and so I thought I could pass the exam. So the next thing I knew, I got a telephone call from a new Department of Commerce office on Long Island, and said, identified myself and so forth. They called me and said, "We have your letter, and we'd like to come up to Poughkeepsie and give you the examination." And I said, "Well, I could go down there." "No, we're in a hurry. We need licensed mechanics to work on licensed airplanes. There's a shortage of them, because most of the wartime mechanics have married and had families and were not interested in giving up their jobs and becoming airplane mechanics." So he said, "I'll drive up and give you the test." So he did that, and we spent most of the day sitting in his car in a hayfield where one airplane, an old rickety jetty, was parked. That was the only airplane around there, and it was being flown. And he gave me the examination on airplanes and engines. The airplanes were the Jenny and the Standard, which were almost identical as far as structure and design was concerned, and on engines, half a day on airplanes and half a day on engines. In the case of airplanes, you read a book and read a paragraph or two, and then ask me a question, and then write down, I guess he made little notes. And the same thing with engines. Now, the engines were the OX5, the Hispano-Suiza, and the Liberty. Well, I had studied the manuals for all those engines and knew them from A to Z. And he was quite surprised that I could answer the questions, because I had never worked on a Liberty or a Hispano-Suiza, only on an OX5, but I knew the answers to his questions. And he gave me 100% on both exams. He gave me number 2906 license, which I still have. So I got the mechanics license, and fortunately, just a few days later, and a week or two later, the Gates Flying Circus came to town, and they had 5 airplanes. 4 of them were standard J1s, and 3 had Hispano engines, and 1 had a Hall Scott 6-cylinder engine, 200 horsepower. And the other one was a Curtiss R4 biplane, a huge biplane, on the same general design as the Jenny and the Standard, but larger. And it had been re-engined with a Liberty engine. And the pilot was named Ives McKinney, a very colorful pilot. And at the end, I had introduced myself and said that I have a mechanics lesson. They were quite surprised that a young man would have a license in a city with no airplanes flying around. And he said, "How did you do it?" And I said, "Oh, I worked on an airplane and got the license." So he said, at the end of the day, on Sunday, there were 2 badly blowing exhaust valves in that Liberty engine. I'd never been within shouting distance of a Liberty engine before, but he asked me, "Can you fix it, have it ready by next Saturday?" This was on Sunday afternoon. And I said, "Sure, I can do it." And so he went back to Teterboro, where he lived, and I worked on that. I had a job in the machine shop, by the way, again. I had jobs in tool rooms and machine shops every summer vacation, if I could get one. So he said, "Have it ready by Saturday morning." So I worked on my spare time after work each day grinding those valves by hand. I had to take the camshaft off. Fortunately, both cylinders were on one side, and I had it ready for him. So when he came back on Saturday morning, it was ready, and he ran the engine. He was quite pleased and said, "You want a job?" I said, "Sure." So he said, "Well, get in. We'll fly up to Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and you can be my crew chief." So I became his crew chief. He had his girlfriend with him. And we went to Pittsfield. And Pittsfield that weekend was the biggest play, what we call a play, like a circus, in the history of the Great Flying Circus. They did the largest job, that is, the largest revenue of any weekend in the history of the circus. A tremendous crowd was there because of the Lindbergh flights, a lot of interest in aviation. Toward the end of Sunday, he was taking off with a load of passengers in one of his very steep climbing turns with a Liberty engine. A Liberty engine with 4 people at 400 horsepower was phenomenal takeoff. And everybody wanted to ride in that big airplane with the most noise. He had 4 passengers. He was making his climbing turn, and all of a sudden the engine quit. And some smoke and pieces came out. And he just turned around and landed in front of the crowd as if nothing had happened. And passengers got out, and I said, "Oh boy, what did I do wrong?" Well, it happened that it threw a rod. It had nothing to do with what I had. It wrecked the engine, a broken connecting rod. And he said, "Now you have the job of changing engine. So we'll ship another engine up from Teterboro Airport, and I'll leave a helper with you, and you can have it ready next Saturday." So I did that. We changed the engine, got a wrecking car to come out to hoist the engines in and out, and had it ready. So he came back with his girlfriend. Well, he had to fly the airplane over to Troy, New York, which was just a short distance, maybe 35 miles or something. But the ceiling was only about 800 feet, a solid ceiling, with a few thin spots in it. And I said, "How are you going to get over?" He said, "I'm going to go on top." Well, he didn't know a thing about instrument flying. He'd never even seen a turn indicator, but he was a very skillful pilot otherwise. He came from California. And, he said, out in California, we go up through these overcasts all the time. We're doing a lot of speeding to zoom up through. So I got in this airplane with his girlfriend and the helper. There was 4 of us in the plane. And he charged along under the clouds as fast as he could get that thing going. I don't know what the speed was. And he zoomed up into the clouds. And then finally the airplane stalled and dived out of the clouds again. And this happened twice, scared the living daylights out of me, because I knew enough about flying to know how people get killed in airplanes. Well, on the 3rd attempt, he just began to stagger a little bit, and by that time you could see the spot of the setting sun. The sun was setting in the west, and you could just see a little spot of sun. He held the airplane still by that, and he broke out on top. What a surprise it was up there. The blue sky above. I'd never been above the clouds before. It was just beautiful, but boy, how were we going to get down? So he just flew west, and nothing but clouds as far as I could see. The sun set. The sun went down. And he saw a hole. And he said, that little hole, and you could look way down there. It was pitch dark down there. And he made a tight turn, a spiral right down through that hole and broke out. Scared me to death. And broke out on the bottom, and we were in the dark, real dark down there. The sun had gone down, and it was out of overcast except for that little hole. And the lights were shining in the houses and everything. And he flew right over to Troy, New York, and found the airstrip where the other airplanes were parked. It was on Green Island at Troy, and it was owned by the Ford Motor Company, and they had permission to use it, just a little airstrip on there. And in the pitch dark, I don't know how he found it. We flew down over the strip, and we could just barely see the other 4 airplanes parked there, and he landed in the dark. We went to the hotel, and I called back home, told my parents where I was, and asked my brother to get my motorcycle before somebody stole it. So I've worked for the Gate Circus for two or 3 weeks, and then the Department of Commerce granted all their airplanes. And I had bought the wreck of a standard J1 without an engine, and I spent 6 months rebuilding that standard. When I got through with that standard, it was just absolutely beautiful, but the Department of Commerce inspector would not let me carry 4 passengers in the front cockpit. Like the Gates Flying Circus had carried 4 passengers in the front cockpits of J1 standards with Hispano engines for years, and had carried repeatedly about 500,000 people without hurting anybody. But he said it was not safe. But he let me carry 2 passengers in the front, so I knew I couldn't make enough money with that. So I flew it for a while, and got my license, pilot's license. That was another funny story. And I'll tell you that. That's good. I picked up a Jenny, another Jenny, and I flew down to Roosevelt Field by appointment to have my flight test. And the inspector was named George Reams. He was quite a character. He knew about my flying. I'd been flying at Poughkeepsie for a while before I called him, and he knew about my flying and my previous flying in 1923. And so I had the appointment to go down there. It was a beautiful day, and when I got over Long Island Sound, I hit a headwind. Very, very strong headwind. I could hardly make an inch of headway. And I finally got to Roosevelt Field, and the wind was so strong, and I stood still right over the field with a practically cruising speed. And so I made a vertical descent, absolutely vertical descent, and landed within about 50 feet of the fence, and just held the tail out to keep the airplane from blowing away. It was terrific wind, south wind. I don't know how that happened, but about 4 men came out and held the wings and helped me turn crosswind so the airplane wouldn't blow away. And Mr. Reams came out and he said, "You mean to tell me you came down here to take a flight test in this wind?" I said, "Well, I had an appointment." He thought a minute. He said, "Okay, let's go." So off we went. The 4 men still hanging on the wing turned me into the wind, and we lifted right off. And I had quite a time staying over the field because it was so windy. And I had to make spins, a turn and a half in each direction, and come out on a certain heading, and the same heading. And I did that, but each time we spin, we'd have to get back over the field again because we drifted in that terrific wind. And so he made a few banks and so far, and he pointed down with his thumb. There was no communication. And I thought he'd flunked me. So I went down and made another vertical landing, and the man helped me turn the airplane. He said, "Come to the office." So he gave me my license, number 5945. That was my flight test. He knew that I could fly in that wind, and boy, did I have a tailwind going back to Poughkeepsie. I wouldn't fly an OX-5 engine across Long Island Sound today for $50,000. I'd be scared to death to do that today. I didn't think anything of it. It wasn't very long going north. I was very, very rapid with that tailwind. But the wind wasn't that strong up at Poughkeepsie, and I got down without any help. So then I had a limited commercial license I got, because I had 50 hours of flying by that time. That was what was required. That was equivalent to our commercial license today. Not quite, because they limited you to one field. That was it. No cross-country flying, as I remember, something like that. And then later on, I qualified for transport pilot license. So then I was in business and barnstorming, and with the standard J1 that I'd rebuilt. But I sold that, and I taught the owner how to fly it, and I did a very careful job to make sure he wasn't going to ground it and put it on his back. And he flew it home to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I taught him from flying from scratch. He flew it for several years without wrecking it. That airplane is still in existence. It's out in Yellow Springs, Ohio now, and being restored by a man named Jim Hammond. who makes a hobby of restoring old airplanes. It was excellent. It's still in pretty good condition, and he's going to do the job. I visited him one day about 4 years ago. So that got me started, and one thing led to another, and I was doing aerobatic shows and so forth. And then I was barnstorming a new standard, a 5-place new standard, and very, very successfully. And I had serial number 2, which was, they were made in New Jersey, and there's one here at the show today, now. In fact, I saw it hopping. It came from near Poughkeepsie. It's from the old Rhinebeck Aerodrome. So I barnstormed very successfully the new standard. In 1930, I was putting on an acrobatic exhibition with an airplane at the first Miami Air Races. The Marine Corps, Navy, and Army had squadrons down there. They were putting on a pretty wild show with their airplanes in formation. And no civilian pilot was putting on an exhibition. So I said, I'll just do it. I took off without being invited in my new standard 5-place airplane, and it wouldn't even run if I banked it. If I rolled it 90 degrees, the engine would stop. It would stop firing. But I put on a show, and I was the only civilian pilot to put one on. Somebody had to do it. So I did it, and then the Marine Corps pilots came over and said, "Hey, how about joining the Marine Corps?" So I said, "Okay," and they said, "Go up to Pensacola and join the reserve. Maybe you can get to fly with us." Well, I never did that. I went up there and joined, and incidentally, all the Marine Corps and Navy officers, mostly Navy officers there, wanted me to take their families up, because they couldn't take them up in military airplanes. So I did a land office business at Pensacola, taking up the officers and their families. And so that put me in the Marine Corps Reserve. They later sent me to Quantico, and I qualified as naval aviator there. When I joined, I was rated as transport pilot, which was my license. And then I went to Quantico and qualified as naval aviator at Quantico. So I have a 4-digit number on my Marine Corps. I joined a number of different squadrons depending on what part of the country I was flying in. Then I bought a Pitcairn autogyro. I had heard about Sierra when I was in high school and wrote to him, and he wrote me 2 very nice handwritten letters explaining the aerodynamics of the autogyro. And I kept in touch with the developments at Pitcairn. I was the first individual person to buy a Pitcairn PCA-2 autogyro, which is 330 horsepower right engine. I made the first transcontinental flights in each direction with a rotary wing aircraft in 1931, May 1931, May and June. And that was the beginning of my rotary wing flying. And I did a great deal of rotary wing flying after that. And in fact, I took the Pitcairn autogyro on tour and to air shows, and at the National Air Races in Cleveland and the National Air Races in Los Angeles, the International Air Races in Chicago. I was looping it and rolling on top of a loop with a 42-foot rotor and being paid $1,000 to do it. So I was in the money. And I made air shows and loops, numerous air shows around the country, looping it numerous times. I would know it. I couldn't tell how many. I looped it and rolled it on top of the loop numerous times. No damage. I demonstrated the autogyro would not come apart. And that was the suspicion of all the other pilots around the country. They said, "Oh, well, the rotor will come apart." Well, I demonstrated it wouldn't. So after that was over, a few years of that, in 1936, I decided I better get on an airline before I'm too old. So I went to work for United Airlines flying the Boeing 247D, which was the first modern airliner after the Ford. The Boeing 247D was all metal, smooth skin metal, low wing, retractable landing gear. It had constant speed governor and twin engines, 550 horsepower engines by that time, and above all, it had full de-icing. I flew out of United for a couple of years, and Mr. Kellett of the Kellett Auto Gyro Company came after me, and they wanted me to test the first wingless aircraft, the Kellett KD-1 Auto Gyro. So I left United on leave, and to do that, it was supposed to be done in 1 year, but it took 2 years. So I didn't go back to United. I stayed with Kellett and completed the test. That included a dive test, which had never been done with a rotary wing aircraft before. And I dived it. At that time, nobody understood, in this country, understood Mach 1. The Germans were ahead of us on that. They knew about it. All their secret work on aircraft. They had high-speed tunnels and everything we didn't have. We spent our money on boondoggling and so forth instead of aircraft research in this country. So they're ahead of us. So the rotor blades began to disintegrate when they reached the speed of sound. And they caused the aircraft to gyrate in such violent fashion that I couldn't possibly bail out of it. I was held down in the seat and badly bruised and injured by being thrown around the cockpit so violently. And finally I decided the only way to survive, I couldn't get out of it. I tried several times to bail out and couldn't. And I cramped my legs and my knees together very suddenly, and I caught the stick and corralled the stick. It had just been a blur up to that time, and instantly when I did that, the aircraft calmed right down, and to my surprise, came under control. And I entered a descent, a steep descent, almost vertical, and the rotors worked all right. It vibrated, but it got me down on the ground without damage. About 18 inches of each blade tip had disappeared with just a steel spar sticking out. Anyhow, I survived the first dive test of destruction in a rotary wing aircraft. And I believe it's the only one so far. I haven't heard of anybody else being willing to do it. So we developed that aircraft. Incidentally, the inspector was there to watch the test. He said, well, I guess I can't give you the approved type certificate. And I burst out. I said, any aircraft that will bring a pilot down after that kind of abuse should get a certificate. So he agreed with me. We got a certificate for it. Well, in the meantime, Mr. Kellett and I had lobbied the bill through Congress to provide for a one-year experimental operation off the roof of the post office in the center of the city of Philadelphia, carrying mail back and forth to the airport, and requiring 10 flights per day, 6 days per week for 1 year, just a one-year experiment. The first scheduled operation from the roof of the building, and of course with the first wingless aircraft that doesn't approve certificate. So I operated that. I was loaned by Kellett to Eastern Airlines. I got Eastern Airlines to take it, and we wanted an airline to run it. So Eastern bid on it and operated it with me as pilot. I was loaned by Kellett to do it. So I carried that out successfully. The roof was an aerodynamic disaster. The turbulence was unbelievable. And I operated for the 1 year almost 3,000 takeoffs and landings on that roof. And I never once canceled a flight for wind. And I flew in winds as high as 65 miles per hour off that roof on a day when the airline canceled flights because of the high wind. I proved that the auto gyro of the rotary wing aircraft could be flown in high winds and in severe turbulence on the roof. So I was kind of proud of that. And I had the option of going back to Kellett or staying with Eastern, and I decided to stay with Eastern. And so World War II came along, and I was too old for combat, And I was flying for Eastern Airlines as captain. At that time, we were flying DC-3s, of course. And I was appointed chief test pilot for Columbia Aircraft Corporation, in addition to flying on the airline. And that was at Valley Stream, New York, and we were building Grumman duck amphibians. Now, one of those is on exhibit in the museum here, one of the two aircraft that I tested. And I'm very fond of that airplane. We built 330 of them, and we increased the power from 700 horsepower to 1,050 horsepower, so a lot of tests had to be all run over again because of different thrust and weight, center of gravity, and so forth. So I had to make a lot of rather hazardous tests, spin recovery and so forth, and landing in waves of 4 feet, across waves of 4 feet. Well, it turned out the waves were 5 feet, and the temperature was 17 degrees above zero, and there was the seawater. And it was really quite wild landing across those waves. The aircraft was almost like a submarine going through them, and the seawater froze all over the airplane, so I had to taxi it in each time, and they washed it off with fresh water, but the fresh water has a tendency to freeze on the airplane too. But each time I landed, it took off and landed, I had to have it de-iced. We had to get it done that day, because that was we didn't get 4-foot and 5-foot waves very often, and they were very anxious to get the test over with. So I did accomplish that, and we built 330 of them. Also, the Navy needed another airplane. This airplane was a very important airplane, by the way. It was used for air-sea rescue, and it literally rescued hundreds of people out of the water, and especially in the Pacific. Men who had been on ships that were torpedoed or shot down in airplanes. And some of them, I've talked to some of them later, and they just worshiped that duck because the duck rescued them. So the Navy needed another larger one. The duck carried 4 men in litters inside. They needed one that carried 8 men in litters. And so there was a preliminary design at Grumman. So we took that design and finished it. That was the XDL-1, and it was an all-metal mid-wing monoplane, very modern construction, with partially folding wings, so it wouldn't take up too much room on a flight deck. And I ran all the tests on that. That was quite a job. A lot of tests to be run. And I had to land that in 4-foot and 5-foot waves also. And that was another adventure. But that was a marvelous airplane. And we built only 2 of them. And before we got into production, the war ended. Those 2 airplanes are still in existence. One is in the Pima Air Museum at Tucson, Arizona, and the other is in private ownership in California. And I was a captain on Eastern for 25 years, flying the DC-2, DC-3, DC-4, DC-6, DC-7, and 4 types of constellations, and the Lockheed Electra turboprop, and the last 5 years the DC-8 4-engine jet. So my email number is Jenny's to Jets. After my retirement from Eastern, I unretired and bought a Bell helicopter and operated during some police work and other charter flying for several years, until the police got their own helicopters, and then that put me out of business. I tried, in the meantime, to get the hospitals interested in having heliports, and they turned me down because of the danger and the noise and the stink and everything. And now a hospital isn't a hospital today unless it has a heliport, but I was ahead of my time, they wouldn't believe me. So I finally gave up that and retired for good, and I have my own airplane. So I'm still flying at almost 97. I never had a drink of alcohol or a cigarette or even a drink of a drop of coffee in my life. And I decided when I was a young boy that I would never abuse myself in any way. And so I just didn't do it. Never had a drop of alcohol or coffee. I'm a member of the UFO, United Flying Octogenarians. In fact, I was president for about 15 years. And I have a pin here which indicates I'm a pioneer helicopter pilot. A picture of Leonardo da Vinci's idea of what a helicopter should be. He was a remarkable man. He knew that he had to have two rotors to counteract the torque of each. And I belong to too many organizations, I guess. I like them. So here I am. That's my story.